The land stretched wide and endless, a sea of grass swaying under the Texas sun. Cattle dotted the horizon like black ink spilled across parchment, their lowing calls rising and falling with the wind. This was the empire of Jonathan McAllister, a man locals called the Baron of the Brazos. He had earned that title through grit, sharp business instincts, and an iron will. His ranch was one of the largest in 3 counties, and his herds were the envy of any man who had ever swung a lariat. Yet, for all his wealth and influence, Jonathan carried a restlessness in his heart. At 35, he was no longer a young man by frontier standards. Suitors and matchmakers had long whispered, families had long schemed, but Jonathan had stubbornly avoided matrimony. Love, he believed, was a luxury for men with less to lose. A wife meant distraction, and distraction meant weakness. But bloodlines and alliances had a way of forcing even the most independent men's hands. His mother, Margaret McAllister, was not one to sit idle while her son let the family legacy rest on the edge of uncertainty. She had watched neighbors rise and fall, their fortune scattered because they had no heirs or because they married unwisely. For her, the future of the McAllister name was too precious to gamble. And so, without asking Jonathan's permission, she struck a bargain. The arrangement was with the Whitfields, a wealthy but struggling family from the eastern part of the state. They had land, but no cattle. They had influence, but dwindling coffers. What they offered was their daughter, Eleanor Whitfield, a woman rumored in hushed tones to be plain, perhaps even homely. Jonathan had heard the whispers, too. In town, men chuckled when her name came up. A Whitfield girl, you say? Well, God bless her. She's got a kind heart, but she ain't much to look at. He dismissed the comments at first, but as the day of the arrangement drew near, a knot of unease tightened in his chest. Beauty wasn't everything, he told himself, but he couldn't ignore the sting of marrying someone he had never chosen, never loved, and perhaps would never desire. He remembered the first time his mother had broached the subject. It was at supper, the long oak table lit by oil lamps, the smell of roasted venison still in the air. "You'll thank me one day, Jonathan," she said, slicing her meat with calm precision. "The Whitfields may not be cattlemen, but their name carries weight. Eleanor is a respectable woman, educated and obedient. Those qualities matter far more than frivolous looks." Jonathan set down his fork, staring at her with narrowed eyes. "So, I'm to marry a stranger because it suits your schemes?" Margaret didn't flinch. "Because it suits the future of this family. You can't run an empire alone forever. A wife at your side will bring stability. Heirs. And if the rumors are true about Eleanor's lack of beauty, then all the better. A pretty face has ruined many men. You need a woman who'll steady you, not tempt you." The words lodged in Jonathan's chest like a burr. He had no desire to argue further. Margaret McAllister was a woman who rarely lost when she had set her mind to something. But in the days that followed, he found himself wrestling with the thought. What did it mean to bind himself for life to someone he might never look at with fondness? Could he stand a future where his bed was cold not for lack of warmth, but for lack of affection? He rode out often to clear his head, the rhythmic pounding of hooves under him giving voice to his unease. The men who worked his ranch sensed his brooding but said nothing. Ranch hands knew better than to pry into the affairs of the boss. It wasn't until Jonathan received the formal letter from Mr. Whitfield himself that the reality truly struck. The handwriting was neat, the words stiff with propriety, but the meaning was clear. The Whitfields expected the match to be honored. The wedding would be held in 2 months' time at the Whitfield estate. That night, Jonathan poured himself more whiskey than usual. He sat alone on the porch, watching the stars scatter like diamonds across the ink-black sky. The cicadas sang, the cattle lowed in the distance, but he heard none of it. His mind was filled only with the image of a faceless woman, rumored ugly, yet destined to be his wife. He thought of escape, of refusing, of tearing up the agreement and sending the Whitfields back their promises. But pride held him back. To dishonor an arrangement would not only insult his mother but also cast a shadow over the McAllister name. In Texas, A man's word was currency. Breaking it was a debt no wealth could repay. And so, reluctantly, Jonathan began to prepare. Tailors were called for his suit, invitations were sent, and plans were made for the long journey east. He did what duty demanded, but his heart remained heavy. Each day closer to the wedding felt like another nail sealing a box he'd willingly stepped inside. The whispers in town grew louder as the news spread. The cattle barons finally settling down, folks said with sly grins. But to a Whitfield girl? Didn't think he'd take to plain pasture. Jonathan ignored them outwardly, but inwardly, their words stung. On the eve of his departure, he stood once more on his land. The sun set in a blaze of crimson, the Brazos River catching the light like molten fire. He breathed deeply, letting the scent of grass, earth, and cattle fill his lungs. This was his kingdom, his legacy, and he was about to share it with a woman he neither knew nor wanted. He mounted his horse, riding back toward the ranch house where his bags were packed. As hooves struck the dirt, he muttered under his breath, a vow as bitter as it was resigned. If she truly is as ugly as they say, then so be it. I'll keep my word. But my heart will remain my own. The land stretched wide like a monument to faded grass swaying. Its white columns were streaked with age. Cattle dotted the horizon like black ink spilled across parchment. Their lowing calls rising and falling with a reminder of what this family was the empire of Jonathan McAllister. When Jonathan McAllister arrived with his mother and a few trusted hands, he had earned that the weight of history and the bite of business instincts and an iron grounds. His ranches lined the gravel drive, largest in and ladies counties, in their finest and his gowns herds were the envy of any man who had ever swung a lariat. Brazos dismounted. Yet, for all his wealth gave him firm nods, assessing Jonathan him carried as one rancher does in his heart. But Jonathan felt their eyes. He was no longer a young man by frontier standards. Curious about the choice suitors and matchmakers had long whispered. The preparations had long schemed with urgency. But Jonathan servants stubbornly avoided matrimony, and the smell of roses and beeswax polish was a luxury for men with less to lose. Jonathan kept his face impassive. A wife meant distraction, but inside, and distraction meant toward the altar felt like another mile deeper. And alliances had a way of he could not climb out of. Even the most when at last the ceremony began, his mother, the music swelled, Margaret McAllister, congregation was not one to sit idle. Jonathan turned, let the family legacy rest on the edge of uncertainty. Eleanor Whitfield. She had watched neighbors rise and fall. Worse. Their fortunes scattered because they had no heirs or because they married unwisely. She was simply ordinary. The future of the McAllister name was too precious to gamble. Her hair pulled too tightly without asking Jonathan's permission. She wore no sparkle. The arrangement was with the Whitfields. Her eyes, a wealthy but struggling family from the eastern part of the state, that might have softened her otherwise unremarkable appearance. They had Jonathan's jaw dwindling coffers. He bowed his head slightly as their daughter. Eleanor Whitfield, heavy. A woman rumored to be his wife, tones to be not plain, the beauty others flaunted, perhaps even not homely. The woman men envied. Jonathan had heard the whispers called dull in town, perhaps even men chuckled when her name came up. The vows were spoken. A Whitfield, the rings exchanged. Well, and before God and bless her, Jonathan McAllister and Eleanor Whitfield were bound to look as husband and wife. He dismissed the comments at first, filled the church, but as the day of the arrangement drew near, the sound was hollow. A knot of the wedding feast followed, in his chest, full of laughter. Beauty wasn't everything. Eleanor sat beside him, but he couldn't ignore the sting of marrying someone he had never chosen. She neither simpered nor blushed, perhaps would never desire. She did not laugh easily. He remembered the first time his mother had broached the subject. She felt like a shadow at his side. The long oak table lit by oil lamps. That night, the smell of roasted venison still in the air. Jonathan stood by the window one day, staring at the moonlight spilling, slicing her meat with calm precision. Eleanor quietly removed her jewelry, may not be cattlemen, folded her dress with their name carries weight, and moved about the room. Eleanor is a respectable woman, someone raised educated and obedient. When she spoke, those voice qualities was calm. Matter far more than frivolous. I know this was not your choosing, she Jonathan said without bitterness, staring at her with narrowed eyes. It was not mine either. So, I'm to marry a stranger because it suits your schemes. Can grow into something else. Didn't flinch if we allow it. Because it suits Jonathan the future of this family. Surprised by the steadiness of her alone forever. You speak a wife as at your side will bring all a matter of business. Heirs. Perhaps it is, if the rumors are true about Eleanor's lack of beauty, sustains families, then all the better. And marriage sustains legacies. Has ruined many men. If we cannot begin with love, you need a woman who'll steady you, let us begin with respect. The words lodged in Jonathan's lingered in his mind long after she blew out the candle. He had no desire to argue further. Respect. Margaret
He had
McAllister was a
expected
woman
tears,
who rarely
resentment,
lost when she had set
or
her mind
perhaps
to something.
attempts to win his
But in the
favor.
days that followed,
Instead,
he found
she
himself
offered a partnership,
wrestling with the
practical,
what did it
sensible,
mean to
almost
bind
cold.
himself for life
The
to
days
someone
that
he
followed
might
confirmed
never
it.
look at with
Eleanor
fondness.
moved into his
Could
household
he stand
with
a
grace,
future where his
but
bed was
not
cold,
flourish.
not for lack of
She
warmth,
did not meddle
but for
in
the
the
ranch's
ranch's affairs.
affairs?
He
Though
rode
she
out often
listened
to
when
clear his
spoken
head.
to.
The
She
rhythmic
managed the
pounding of
house with
hooves under
efficiency,
him, giving voice
earning
to
the
his
quiet
unease.
approval of the
The
staff.
men who worked his
Yet
ranch
she remained
sensed his
distant
brooding
from
but
Jonathan,
said nothing.
neither
Ranch
seeking his
hands
affection
knew better
nor
than to
offering
pry
hers.
into the affairs of the
At
boss.
supper,
It
she
wasn't
would ask
until
about the
Jonathan
day's work,
received the formal
listening
letter
attentively,
from Mr. Whitfield
yet
himself
never
that the
prying.
reality
On
truly
Sundays,
struck.
she
The
sat
handwriting
beside
was
him at
neat,
church,
the
her
words
hymns
sung
sung
with
softly,
propriety,
her
but the
presence
meaning was
modest.
clear.
In
The
town,
Whitfields
she
expected
carried
the match
herself
to be
with
honored.
dignity.
The
Though
wedding would be
Jonathan
held
noticed
in
the
2 months'
sideways
time
glances
at
of
the
others.
Whitfield estate.
The whispers
That
had
night,
followed her here.
Jonathan poured
She's no
himself
beauty,
more whiskey
that's for
than
sure.
usual. He sat
McAllister
alone
could
on the
have had his
porch,
pick.
watching
Why
the
her?
stars scatter
Well,
like diamonds across
maybe
the
he wanted a
ink-black
wife
sky.
who wouldn't cause trouble.
The cicadas sang.
Jonathan bristled
the
at the
cattle
gossip,
lowed in the distance.
though he never
but
admitted
he
why.
heard none of it.
He told
His
himself
mind
it
was
pride,
filled only with the
not care
image
for her.
of a faceless
Yet when
woman,
he saw Eleanor
rumored
walking
ugly,
through town with
yet
her head
destined
held
to be his
high,
wife,
ignoring
he
the whispers,
thought of escape,
something
of
inside
refusing,
him shifted,
of tearing up
one
the agreement
evening,
and
as
sending
summer
the
bled
Whitfields
into
back
fall,
their promises.
Jonathan returned
But
from the
pride held
range
him back.
later than usual.
To dishonor an
He
arrangement
expected
would
the
not
house dark,
only insult his
but
mother,
found
but also
Eleanor in the
cast a
parlor,
shadow over
a
the
lamp
McAllister
burning
name.
beside her.
In Texas,
She was reading
a man's
Shakespeare.
word was
He
currency.
noticed with some surprise.
Breaking it was a debt
"You enjoy
no
that?"
wealth
he asked,
could repay.
loosening
And
his gloves.
so,
Reluctantly,
she looked up.
her
Jonathan
expression
began to
unreadable.
prepare. Tailors
enjoy
were called for
words that
suit.
remind me there is more
Invitations
to
were
life
sent,
than cattle
and
and
plans
land.
were made for the
Jonathan
long journey
smirked,
east.
though not
He did what
unkindly.
duty demanded.
You'll
but
find
his heart
little else
remained
on the Brazos.
heavy. Each day
Then
closer
it is
to
up
the
to
wedding
me to
felt
keep
like
my
a
mind alive,
nail sealing a
she
box.
replied,
He'd willingly
turning a page.
stepped inside.
Her
The
answer
whispers
struck him.
in town grew
He had
louder
dismissed
as
her
the
as
news spread.
plain, dull
The cattle
even.
barons finally
But here was a
settling
mind
down.
sharp and
Folks
unyielding.
said with sly grins.
She spoke not to
but
impress
to a
him,
Whitfield girl,
but because
didn't
it was
think
her
he'd
truth.
take to plain pasture.
He found himself lingering
Jonathan
longer than he
ignored them
meant to,
outwardly,
asking
but
her questions
inwardly,
about what she
their
read,
words stung.
listening
On
as
the
she
eve of his
explained
departure,
passages with
he
clarity.
stood once
It
more
was
on
the
his
first
land.
time Jonathan
The
felt
sun
something
set in
other
a
than
blaze of
indifference
crimson
toward his wife.
The Brazos River
Still,
catching the light like
the distance
molten
remained.
fire.
He
Nights
breathed
were often
deeply,
silent,
letting the scent
their
of
marriage
grass,
was more
earth,
truce than
and
union,
cattle fill
more
his lungs.
arrangement than bond.
This was his kingdom,
Jonathan poured
his
himself
legacy,
into his ranch,
and
he was
while
about to
Eleanor
share it with a
quietly
woman he
maintained
neither
the
knew
household.
nor wanted.
But small
he
moments
mounted his
began
horse,
to unsettle
riding
him.
back toward the
way
ranch
she
house,
spoke
where his
gently
bags
to
were
a sick
packed.
ranch hand,
As hooves struck
sitting
the
by
dirt,
his bedside,
he muttered
until he
under his
recovered.
breath.
The
A
way she
vow as
managed
bitter as
provisions
it was
during a
resigned.
sudden shortage.
If she
ensuring
truly
no
is as
worker
ugly as they
went
say,
hungry,
then so
the way
be it.
her voice
I'll
carried
keep my
steady
word,
authority when
but my
others might
heart,
have panicked.
My heart
Jonathan
will
began
remain
to
my own.
realize something he had not considered. Eleanor might not possess beauty that turned heads, but she possessed strength that steadied lives. Yet pride is a stubborn thing. He would not admit it, not even to himself. And so, he carried on, outwardly detached, inwardly restless. It was not until the crisis came, swift and brutal, that Jonathan's world, and his view of Eleanor, would truly begin to change. It was
land
late
stretched
autumn,
wide
when
like
the
a
first
monument,
signs of
a
trouble
sea of
reached
grass
McAllister
swaying
Its
ran
white
under the
columns
Texas
were
sun.
cattle rustlers had been
Cattle
spotted
dotted
along
the
the horizon
horizon
shutters
shutters
had
had
long
long
spilled
bold
across
enough
our
to
cut
peel.
fences,
Their
and
low
their
drive
walls
branches
rising
and
and
dead of
falling
night.
with
A
the wind.
reminder
At
of
first,
what the
this was
family
Jonathan
empire
dismissed
of
it when
petty
Jonathan
petty
McAllister
a man
arrived with
locals
his
mother
mother
and
and
baron
few
of the
trusted
Brazos
hands.
hands.
A few missing
He
heads
had
earned
both
both the
the
weight
title
of
to
his
his
business
and the
sharp
bite of his
as then,
instincts.
a
Gas
foreman
and
rode
iron
the
were
grounds.
on. His
Ranch
ranch
was
was one of the largest
type,
in
and
3
ladies
counties.
taken nearly
And
50
his
herds
whispered
were
behind
behind, and
like
their
a man
organized
would
would
ever
ever
swung
swung
a
a
lariat.
lariat.
Brazos dismounted.
Yet Jonathan's
For all his
men gave him
well-planned
firm
influence,
nods. 50
a
head
sense
wasn't
of
him,
Jonathan
as a
carried
one
a
rancher.
restlessness
If
in
the
his heart.
raids continued,
But Jonathan
35
felt their eyes
he was
linger
no longer a
longer
young
than
man
usual
by
as
frontier
he was
crumbled.
curious about the
He
choices
gators
of
and
men.
matchmakers
Rode
and
the boundaries,
whispered,
the
set
preparations
families
had
on
long
fire
schemed,
with urgency.
But
Still, Jonathan
servants
started
started
across
avoided
avoided
with
cunning
cunning
and the
precision.
smell of
Love
roses appearing
and
into the
wax
mess
polish
was a luxury for
riders
men
could
with
catch
less
Jonathan
Jonathan
kept
kept
the
his
men's
face
wife
through
meant
morale
distraction
aside, and
every
every
step
step
toward
the
the altar
of
of the
felt like
Brazos
another
might
might
be
final
alliance
be had a way of
he could not
forcing
Jonathan
even the most when at
into
last
the
the
men's
ceremony
hands.
began.
He spent
His
sleepless
mother,
nights
music swelling
Margaret
over
McAllister,
and the
congregation
calculating
was not one to
losses,
sit idle
Jonathan's
on
turn
turn,
let the
family
family
legacy
for
rest
all
on
his
the
grace
edge
she
of
was
frustration.
Eleanor
Not a
she had
Whitfield.
watched neighbors
He felt
rise
as
and
fall
fall,
were
wrestling
their
shadows.
fortunes scattered.
It was
painted
Eleanor
Eleanor
who
who
broke the
broke
silence
because
because that wasn't
married
the truth.
unwisely.
The study.
She was
for her
simply ordinary.
The future of the
features
McAllister
on their
name
term
was
her
too
frame
precious
slender.
gamble.
Her hair
Setting
was
aside
so
too
tightly
without
back
Jonathan's
Jonathan's
permission.
permission.
She wore no sparkle.
What would you know of
the arrangement
Brazos?
Was with the Whitfields.
Her eyes,
her gaze did not
clear
and steady family
to
from
see
the
the
eastern
warmth
part of the
that might have
state.
softened
You chase
her
after land,
outline,
but no
cattle.
but they're expecting
They had
that.
Jonathan's
They
jaw
know your men
tightly
tired.
He bowed his
What
head
they offered
slightly
to
as
their
he
daughter.
crossed herself.
Eleanor
Jonathan
Whitfield
frowned.
A woman
lowering
lowering
to
to
be
be
his
his
wife.
wife. Tones
Then
not
what
the
he
beauty
suggests,
others
perhaps
flaunted.
patience,
Even
not
the
she
woman
said.
men ends
Jonathan
that
had
traps
heard the
and set
whispers
charges
called
too.
dull
Let them
and
think you're
perhaps
blind on
even
one side.
chuckled
When her
then
name
perhaps
came
vows
them
were
the
spoken.
A Whitfield the
The
rings
rings
exchanged.
torn
Well,
between
before
irritation
God
and
and
intrigue.
Jonathan
She
McAllister
spoke
and
with quiet
Eleanor
certainty.
Whitfield
She
were
is
bound.
no
No strategy
husband
came
and
naturally
wife.
to
dismissed
her.
the comments
Applause
against
built
his
better
church,
judgment.
but as the
He
day
listened.
of the
The
arrangement drew
He ordered
near,
the men to
sound
ease
not
patrols
of
on the
wedding
western
feast
edge
followed,
leaving
full
it
of
looking
laughter
vulnerable.
Beauty wasn't
and
everything.
chatting. Hidden among the
Eleanor
Brazos,
sat
however,
beside him.
but
He
stationed
couldn't
his
ignore
life
the
sting of
riders,
marrying
answering
someone
questions
he
he had
had
never
never
chosen.
chosen.
She
One
neither
neither
simpered
simpered
nor
nor
perhaps
became,
would never
but she
dry
did not
a dozen
laugh.
cattle
He
before
remembered
the
the
break.
first time
To
his mother
Jonathan's
had
time,
broached the
she
subject.
felt like her shadow
was
closed
up
in
in like
the
the
long
long
oak
oak
table
table
lit
lit
by
by
oil
oil
fire
fire
cracked
to
smell
smell
of
of
roasted
roasted
hares
hares
and
and
in the
in
chaos.
Jonathan
Half
stood by the
thanked
window
me
one day.
after,
Jonathan,
staring
the
at the
rest
moonlight
scattered,
spilling,
leaving
slicing
their
her
plunder
meat
behind.
with calm precision.
Eleanor
When the dust
quietly
settled,
removed her
Jonathan
jewelry. Not
realized
folded
Eleanor's
her dress
plan
their hair,
had saved
Harry's
him
weight.
more than
Moved about the
cattle.
room
Eleanor
with the
had
air
restored his
expressions
men
and
someone
faith,
raised,
educated
proud
and
and
obedient.
when she
The
spoke,
story
those
surrounds.
qualities
calm.
mattered.
It was Eleanor
I know
McAllister
this was not
who
your
had
choosing.
outsmarted the
Jonathan
rest.
sat
Without
down.
bitterness.
Jonathan's pride
Staring
was
at her
hurt
with
at
narrowed
first.
eyes.
It was not
But as
mine
he
either.
watched her move among
I'm
the
to
married
marry a stranger.
strangers.
Thank
Because
duty.
it suits
I
your
believe
studying them with calm
can grow
words.
into something else.
Admiration
If we allow it.
because it suits
Jonathan
your
done what
future
he could
family.
not.
Surprised
Not
by
run
the
and
steadiness
entire
of her
alone
faith.
forever.
Quiet
You
wisdom.
speak
A wife
as
at your
though
side
that
will follow
follows
the
matter
matter
of trials.
Heirs.
Perhaps
and
it
if the
is.
rumors are true about
Eleanor's
Eleanor's
business
interview,
sustains family.
Eleanor
took
took
charge of
Rasdane's
Rasdane's
face
legacy.
has
Organizing
ruined
supplies.
many.
You cannot begin
You
with
need a woman
sufficiency.
who'll steady
Then
you,
when
not
his
begin with
family
respect.
lost
The
their
words
home
lodged
to fire.
over
Jonathan
she
has
insisted
on
on
housing them in
after
their
she
had
had
no
no
desire
desire
to argue for
earning
respect.
gratitude.
Margaret
He had
McAllister was a woman
McAllister
who rarely
standing
lost
community.
when she had set
Or
her
bit
mind
by
to
bit.
attempts to win his
Jonathan
favor.
days
Saw
that
her
followed.
instead.
Light.
He found
She
himself
offered
he was
a
not
wrestling
playing
with the
practical.
thought truly.
What did it
sensible.
mean
There
to
was a
bind himself
beauty
for
in
life?
her
The
resolve.
days
Someone
that
he
followed
might
confirmed
never
her
look
that
at
was
with
Eleanor
her
moved
stern
into his
features.
household. Could he stand a
with
future
the fire that
where
had
not
glimmered in her
cold,
eyes
not
for
when
lack
she
of
did
warmth,
not
but
meddle
for
in
lack
the
of
one night.
affairs.
He
After
rode
she
out all
listened
day
to
and
his
driving
gratitude.
cattle to higher
She
ground,
managed
pounding
the house
Jonathan
with his
returned
hand,
to
giving
find
voice
Eleanor
to his
waiting on the
approval
porch.
of the
The
staff.
men who
She
worked
had
his
little
ranch
she
remained
remained
his
disbrooding.
brooding.
Jonathan
Jonathan touching
nothing.
strands
Neither
of her
raising
hair.
his
His
affection
knew better
nor
than
offering
pry
hers.
into the
For the
affairs of
first
his
time,
supper.
It
He
wasn't
noticed
until
how
Jonathan
Jonathan
worked
received
her
the
face,
formal
listening
letter from Mr.
attentively,
Whitfield
yet
himself
gentleness
prior.
blended
On
into
Sundays,
striking. She
The
sat
hair
beside
lighting
him
was
in
neat,
church.
she said softly.
The
For
words
himself
he
with
managed
propriety.
a tired
Her presence
smile.
was clear.
The herd
In
knew
the
him.
Whitfields
She
expected the
carried
match. She
herself
studied
beyond
him for a
dignity.
moment.
The wedding
Though Jonathan
handed
noted
him
him
two
sideways
months
glances
at
at
the
the
and you
Whitfield
needed
estate.
rest.
The whispers
That
had
night,
followed
as their
her here.
fingers
Jonathan
brushed,
poured
she's no
himself
beauty.
more
Jonathan
whiskey
felt
than
sure.
usual.
Small,
McAllister could have had
undeniable. Watching
Why
the
held her
stars
gaze
scatter
longer
like
than
diamonds
he ever
across
Maybe
the
he wanted a
black
wife
sky.
something unspoken
cicadas
between
sang.
Jonathan bristled
The
at the
cattle
gossip
warmer
in the
than
distance.
though he never
Admitted
admitted
word
none
none
of it.
He told
His
himself
days
it was
turned
pride,
into only with
not
the narrative
lives
of a faceless
Yet when he
woman.
saw Eleanor
Rumored
walking
ugly,
through town
yet
with supper
destined
held
to be
high,
his
small
wife.
conversations,
Ignoring the
he thought
whispers,
of stolen
escape,
glances,
something
of
inside
he
him
found
shifted.
himself
Of
tearing up
one
the agreement
counsel,
and
as
not
some
out of
were
Whitfield's
obligations
back their
but desire.
promises.
Jonathan
He
returned
wanted
for
her
her
arranged
arranged
later,
her
than
company
usual.
to dishonor
Her
an
presence
arrangement
affected
would
the
not
house
one
darkening.
evening insulted
Winter
mother.
winds
Eleanor
also
cast
cast
a
a
shadow
over the
Jonathan
Jonathan
finally
beside
broke
her.
the
In
silence.
Texas,
She was
had
reading
long
a man's
Shakespeare
word
to
was
them.
currency.
He noticed
I
with
was
some
wrong about
breaking
you.
it was a
He
debt
admitted.
you enjoy
No
that
wealth
he
he
could
could
repay.
repay.
Loosening
When I
his gloves.
saw you,
She looked thought I'd been trapped.
Jonathan began to
unreadable.
I didn't
Taylor's
enjoy
recalled
words
but you
that
show me
remind
more
me there is
invitations
more
were
to
sent
life
and
and
cattle
and
and
than
plans
I
were made
ever
for the
imagined.
Jonathan
Journeys.
smirked. You've been the
Though
backbone
not
of
at
what
his
duty
wish,
demanded.
when I could
You'll
not, but
find
his heart
Eleanor
remained
looked at him
Brazos.
quietly.
Each day
Then
glided
it
to
the
the
wedding
to
felt
keep
like
my
an
mind
and
around
show me that
feeling
respect
above
can grow into
willingly
turning a page.
stepped
And
inside.
perhaps
Her
answers
whispers
something
and
town
greater.
grew
He had
louder.
dismissed
Jonathan
her as
reached
plain,
for her hand.
dull
Cattle
even,
barons
not out of
finally
settling
settling
down,
but
sharp
long
and
folks.
unyielding.
She let him
with
take
like
her.
she spoke
And
not
for the
to a
first
Brazos
time
Whitfield
since
girl,
their
because
vows,
it was
think
her
he'd
truth.
take to
Warmth
plain
bloomed
path
he
between
found
them.
himself lingering
Jonathan
longer than
ignored
he
them
meant to.
outwardly,
Had
asking
weathered
her
storms.
questions about what she
There
read.
were rustlers
Some
were
listening
gone. On
as
the
she
eve
heard
of
his
his
departure.
messages with
He
clarity.
stood
Brazos
once
more
more
on
on
his
the first
land.
time Jonathan
But
saw
more than
something
other
other
days
more
difference
cattle
toward
had been
his wife.
swayed.
The Brazos River
Still,
marriage
the
born
light,
of
the
arranged
distance
molten
remained,
fire.
shadowed by
Nights were
grief,
often
deep in
had
silence, letting
transformed
ascend
their
to a
marriage
grass
was
of
more
earth,
truth than
and
union.
cattle
The town's
filled
whispers
arrangements
changed
and
with
bonds.
this was his
Jonathan
kingdom. No longer
forged
does
they
they
mocked
mocked
the Baron
and
for
here's
marrying
about
to
Eleanor
share it with a
quietly
woman he
making
neither
the
knew
household.
nor
They
wanted.
spoke
But
of
Eleanor
Eleanor
McAllister
McAllister
began to unsettle
riding
him.
back
Of her
toward
withering
the way she
house,
spoke
her
gently
back
to
to
a
her pack,
sick
her
quiet
hand.
as hooves struck
Sitting
the
by
Jonathan
his
himself
bedside,
muttered
said
under
under
one
his
evening,
the
a
way
vow
she
as
managed
bitter
her
as it
visions
was
during a
designed.
sudden shortage.
Watching the
If she
sun
truly
shine
is as
over
ugly
her
as they
went
say,
hungry,
then
and
so the way
Sylvia.
her voice
I
carried
thought my
authority,
word, marrying a
when
bird, my
others
heart
murmured.
panicked.
My
His
heart
arms Jonathan
slipping
began
around
to
to
realize
something he
but
had
I
not
see
considered.
now I was given a treasure.
Eleanor might not possess
Beauty
fame,
faded that turned
but what
heads.
you've given me, She possessed
loyalty,
strength,
courage,
that steadied
love.
lives. That is the
Yet pride
truest
is
kind
a
of
stubborn
beauty.
thing.
Eleanor
not
rested
admit
her
it,
head against
not
a
even to
shoulder,
himself.
her lips
And
curving
so,
into the smallest
he carried
of
on,
smiles.
outwardly
For a woman
detached,
once dismissed as
inwardly
plain,
restless.
she had become
It was
radiant.
not until the crisis
Not
came,
because the world's
swift
whispers
and
had
brutal,
changed,
that
but
Jonathan's
because she had
world
revealed the
and his
depths
view of
who
Eleanor
she truly was.
would truly
And
begin to
Jonathan
change.
McAllister, the proud baron of the Brazos, finally understood that he had not been trapped at all.
He had been saved.